packet pushers.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Packet Protector, the podcast at the intersection of networking and security. I'm Jennifer J.J. Vanella, here with Drew Conry Murray, and we're also here today with Tom Lawrence of Lawrence Systems. If you haven't checked out Tom's YouTube videos and site, we've got links in the show notes. We'll be talking about that. We had a listener request about VPN, so thank you guys for telling us about the topics you want to hear about. And some of the questions were from the VPN world. What is WireGuard? How is it different than OpenVPN? Are these things we use in the enterprise? How does this compare to IPSec and IKE? So we found Tom, who was willing to come on and give us a little rundown of everything. So we talk about WireGuard, a lot of WireGuard information, overlay VPNs, which I think is really interesting because most of these do use WireGuard. We really dive into how to detect and know that these things are running in your environment if you're on a SecOps team. So great information there. Personal VPNs, we dive into some of the specific overlay VPN providers and technologies. We hit a little bit on how Bowtie fits into this, which was one of our recent sponsored episodes. And then hot sauces, Drew.
We got to hot sauces, which was a lot of fun. We don't spend a lot of time on hot sauce, but that is a little surprise at the end if you're into the hot sauce scene and you want to find out what we're up to.
Oh, no. The surprise is Drew's new tagline he's testing out, which I will let you judge.
We're testing. We're running some tests. We're testing in prod, and we'll see what happens.
So let's dive in with Tom.
So, Tom, welcome to the podcast. And I guess let's just get started with a simple question. What is WireGuard?
WireGuard is maybe we'll call it next generation because we've used some of these old protocols for a long time. So it is a newer protocol for doing the site-to-site VPNs, VPN protocol. It's just a lot more simplified than the ones we've had. The problem with anything that was invented a number of years ago is as technology has improved and as our understanding of it has improved, we have to build things better. And oddly, there's less lines of code in some of the new things we build. So it is actually a simpler implementation, which is what gets a lot of people excited. It's also faster. It's efficient. It's one of the few times that Linus, who's developing in the Linux kernel, looked at the code and said, wow, that's actually nice. And so, which is not something he's known to say.
Right. That's like a blessing from on high.
Yeah, blessing on high. Like, this looks good. I believe there was some commentary where he didn't hate it. And that's like, oh, good. He's,
That's 2 thumbs up. And when we're talking newish, like last 5 or 6 years or so?
Yeah, I think about maybe just a little bit longer than that now because time stopped around 2020 in my head. So it's, I think probably 6 or 7 years. Yeah.
Okay.
It's gained a lot more popularity, though, over the last few years, and especially because of the events of 2020, people need a lot more connectivity for remote workers, and so WireGuard has kind of become popular for that. The protocol itself is much more friendly to doing things like NAT traversal, so it becomes an underlying feature of many products that bake it in because, someone's working from home, but they need to get to those enterprise applications in a secure way. So WireGuard's kind of picked up a lot of steam as the underlying technology for a lot of products that have been built over the last 5 years.
So how would you contrast it to, you said this is next gen, so I'll say traditional VPNs.
Traditional VPNs. IPSec is still alive and well. Legacy has a really long tail, and it's going to be around for a while. It's still what the majority of firewall companies are going to use for their site-to-site. Some of the reasoning for it is also because of their tooling and things like that has all the extra routing. And of course, techs that are familiar with a system that works is not going to change it for another system. But WireGuard being more efficient, one of the real big advantages isn't just speed because on the same hardware, it's a little faster. It's also got really big advantages in things like ARM. So when you compare it to something like ARM, and because so many of us are using phones, WireGuard becomes a really popular feature because it's exceedingly fast on ARM and traverses those, as I kind of mentioned earlier, so it's like the NAT traversal very well. And so many people are on mobile devices. So we need to be able to secure tunnels back on our mobile devices. IPsec on a phone has always been less than great. We'll just say.
That's one way to put it.
Yeah, there's always like, oh yeah, they're blocking it, or oh yeah, this NAT translation rule is going to break your IPsec VPN. It won't work under these environments. So you have all these pain in the butt things. WireGuard, one of the reasons it was written is because it avoids all of those problems. In the same time, being faster, like, hold on, it has less problems and it's faster and it does key negotiation faster because who's got patience to wait for your tunnel to spin up in an IPsec VPN? Like, even if it's only 5 seconds, I want my answer now to whatever I typed in a query for. I don't got time to wait for this up. So that simpler protocol, and it's only a singular protocol, so you don't have the compatibility. Back to, they said, why do we have all this? Oh, it's because over years of generations of IPsec, we took IPsec as a protocol and then said we can change out ciphers. Well, as modern computers get faster, and that allows people to crack the old ciphers, we can swap out new ciphers. But that leads to, I think all these ciphers should be in OpenVPN and IPsec. So now it's a negotiation of, well, what's the settings? I want to connect protect my device? What's your settings? So we can modify them. So now there's a whole slew of options and checkboxes because you allowed too many. WireGuard doesn't have such things. It's a versioned type of protocol where version 1 is where we're at right now. And that's it. You're going to connect to other version 1s. There's not a way to choose ciphers. It has the ciphers it has. Take it or leave it. That's where it stops. But that simplicity makes it in some ways easier to implement. Going, cool, I don't have to try to figure out, does this device support it? We're all on version 1 here in March of 2025. So that's where they're all compatible with each other.
So a couple of things. One, you said smaller code base, so that helps make it efficient. Two, you're not wasting time with having to do negotiation about what cipher suites we're going to use, what cipher suites we know. I guess it's very, opinionated about what cipher suites it's using. You've got a limited menu and you use it or not. Are there other differences?
It lacks some of the other features of things that OpenVPN has, for example, where there's no facility for user management. That's one of the reasons I said it's baked into a lot of products. If you're going to build a product and you want to figure out a secure transport layer, please don't roll your own security. It's great for security podcasters because it's always something to talk about. So this company rolled their own security, and let me tell you how that went.
Proprietary military grade encryption.
We invented our own version of military grade encryption.
Yeah.
So it's great for security podcasters who want a lot to talk about, but it's not great for actual security of things. WireGuard has no facility for user management. It's all just really simple key exchanges. So, I mean, you can run it from the command line. You can pass keys back and forth, but keys and some comments and kind of fig file is not exactly user management. But because it's an open source protocol and it can be baked into these products, lots of companies that want to build tooling for things like zero trust or just transport layers, they can build their tooling and use that as the transport layer. So they don't have to reinvent the security, but then they can put like the user authentication on top of it and user management or device management on top of it. And that becomes a lot easier for them. It's like, here's the base protocol that is well supported. It's going to be very cross-platform. It's going to work great on things that are running ARM, which is obviously a very popular device category now, especially, Apple's gotten really big into some of this. So cool. We're going to get our nice, fast, efficient on here. I can bake in the tooling to do my own integrations on there versus, if you open VPN, you're going to have user management on there and you have some of those other features. So it's kind of also misleading to say that the code base is smaller because in some ways the code base does less. It was designed to serve as a framework for people to start building on without having a lot of that extra cruft that existed in the older protocols.
Okay, so it sounds like there's a user component that's kind of stripped out of that. So whatever platform integrates WireGuard does their own thing there.
Yep.
What about because I know, traditional IPsec tunnels, one of the things we do in that first establishing of an IKE tunnel is really just to authenticate the other end and validate that we think we know who we're talking to. Is that built into WireGuard or is that also kind of pulled out back into the framework?
It validates just through a public-private key exchange. So they're not using symmetrical keys, they're using public-private ones. So you do have to have those identifiers in there. So when it does the connection, but one of the nice things is it doesn't tell you when you failed, which is good and bad. So people can't kind of guess their way. And of course, using public-private key cryptography doesn't make guessing easy at all. So you keep the private key. We just take those matching public pairs and put them on the other side. So only when the keys match is there any type of response at all. Kind of makes it nice for security because it's not banging away at it or trying to log in or trying to match certificates. Like you'll get OpenVPN, you'll send certificates, you'll identify the users by a certificate, then a username and password. But if you look at your OpenVPN logs, there's tons of certificate mismatch coming along. It's similar, but a little quieter on the WireGuard side for simplicity.
And I guess one of the other differences is that instead of using Internet Key Exchanger like 2, it's using noise, which I had not heard of. Can you give us sort of the process on noise?
Yes. So noise is a newer protocol. So technically, IKE is just an internet key exchange. Noise technically is going to be a subset, but the noise protocol isn't used in IPsec. For speed and simplicity, noise K is in WireGuard. It's going to be the better choice for speed, but for compatibility, especially in the enterprise space, you're going to go with IKE because that's just kind of what's there for things like that. But as far as the way noise K was designed, this is kind of the basis of WireGuard here. It's designed for speed, efficiency, use, and performance critical applications, requires fewer messages. It doesn't take much to establish these connections. The noise protocol allows really simple negotiation. It's a very clean protocol. Basically, all the knowledge we've had over the years of building better cryptography, they implemented it with a noise protocol in there, which gives it a very low computational overhead. This is one of the reasons it excels on things like ARM. It's reasonably fast, and so is IPsec because crypto acceleration has been around for a really long time for IPsec and the protocols and ciphers that it uses. Well, ARM doesn't always have those facilities built in. You can put coprocessor chips on there, but if you start with a protocol that already works fast on existing ARM silicon or even Intel x86 type based silicon, you're already ahead of the game. So you lack that overhead with the noise protocol. Simplicity is what it's coming back to, and it's been well vetted. The cryptography they're using, because everything's based on the Curve 2519 key exchange, and Cha-Cha Poly 1305. These were ratified long after the existence of IPSec and OpenVPN. These are, in the crypto world, I should say, newer, and they're well vetted by cryptographers. There's those annual meetings that happen that they all get together and decide what the validated ciphers are and standards are set. So the noise protocol takes advantage, and WireGuard takes advantage of those newer protocols being available and not bothering with all the older ones.
And I think we're all a fan of, well, I don't want to speak for everybody. I'm a huge fan of elliptic curve crypto for its lightweightedness and ease. I'm kind of curious, like, do you see, because as somebody who's managed enterprise infrastructures, from an enterprise perspective, I don't think of anything other than IPsec. I just assume, like, especially site to site, like you mentioned, that's what we're doing. Do you see a future in the near distance where maybe some of these enterprise vendors are starting to incorporate something more WireGuard-ish?
It seems like the firewall vendors are really slow to do it, your big enterprise ones. Not really sure why. I think it's just kind of one of those, we'd put it in, but then the techs wouldn't use it, or the techs aren't using it because they're not putting it in and creating documentation. I'm seeing it more tied into the other devices. So you'll have vendors that build the products. They'll start loading some of the tooling and building the products that are using this in the back end. So the user's getting it on their phone, on their laptop. So you can have your remote workers, and then they're tying it to something else inside the network or attached directly to those line of business applications and where those live. So they're running adjacent to it. That's where we're seeing a lot of adoption. It's kind of like the demand for, I want to be able to build these zero trust infrastructures. And I want to be able to have fast, really solid transport layer between my remote worker who wants to work from home or work from some random hotel, but I want them to be secure and have, access to this. And I just can't get the firewall vendor to fix it. But the next layer is these overlay VPN companies who are going to go, I'm just going to solve the problem by bypassing your firewall. Because right away we've seen when everyone started doing the work from home, the firewalls are going, whoa, we cannot handle, we're spec'd out for 500, 600 users, and you just told 2,000 people to work from home. The VPN can't handle that at any actual speed, and it's not out of warranty. It's still got 5 years left on its life cycle because we just bought it. Are we going to replace it? No. Are they going to add this feature through a software update? No. How are we going to solve it? Well, this other company makes this tool. And we're just going to skip VPNing people in, and we're going to start building our zero trust.
We're going to do it the traditional way and punch a hole through the firewall.
Yeah, we're just going to punch a hole in the firewall.
Or the vendors are happy to sell you more hardware and more licenses.
Mhm.
So, yeah, and it's interesting because I think you're kind of getting into we're talking about now almost these overlay VPNs that I've gotten inquiries from CISOs recently about what do we do about this from a policy perspective if different groups, departments, or individuals have kind of helped themselves to technology that IT, it's almost shadow IT at that point, and
It is.
and it bypasses their other tooling. But you hit on something a second ago when you started talking about, zero trust. So why don't you talk a little bit about, I think everybody has their own definition of zero trust.
Yes.
We'd like to hear yours.
Yes. So I like NIST's definition of it. They've done some good wordsmithing here. And we'll start with where the perimeter is. So we always think of the firewall as a perimeter. And I don't always like to say the identity is the new perimeter. The firewall is still a perimeter. I don't want people on the other side of that firewall. But identity is a second perimeter. Security's in layers. This is another layer. And the zero trust, as defined by NIST, and right from their wording here, I'll read it word for word. Zero trust assumes there is no implicit trust granted to assets or user accounts based solely on their physical or network location, i.e. local networks versus the internet, or based on asset ownership, enterprise or personally owned. Authentication and authorization, both subject and device, are discrete functions performed before a session to an enterprise resource is established. So you possessing the position, so you've moved inside the network via VPN. Does that mean you don't have to authenticate against my local line of business applications? Well, no, we want another layer on there. So that's where we want to make sure we identified you. Same thing is if you've wandered off and taken my laptop from the restaurant I left it open at, how do you do attestation that, okay, cool, I'm in, but is the device enough? No, let's go a step further and validate and attest to your identity to make sure we know who you are, make sure you are the person that's validating. So just the act of having the device isn't enough, and just the act of being on the network isn't enough. So I really look at zero trust as we're really attesting to the person that's using the device is allowed to use it. Or sometimes you can also extend that to the device itself, making sure it has a proper set of keys that allows it to access a resource. Because sometimes devices don't need human intervention. We just want to make sure this device can attach to the network in a very secure way. So that can also be part of the zero trust. But generally, we think of it as how we're attesting that the users are who they are.
Yeah, and I think I would just add that because I think one of the questions a lot of people have is, okay, but that sounds like what we've been doing. So what's new? And I think that the new part is that attestation you're talking about, these trust inferences about how much we trust the user, the account, the laptop, like all of those things were ideally in the perfect world integrating into all of these components together so that we understand, like, was that user account, suddenly on the dark web? Is the asset that the user is trying to access dealing with some CVEs or KEVs right now, in which case we might not want somebody sitting at Starbucks accessing that. These other trust inferences that feed into that attestation you're talking about, I personally think is where things are different than just what we were doing before with like different posture checking or validation with VPN, with remote access or network access control, or just the normal stuff we've had for the past, 15 years or so.
Oh yeah, especially a lot of times VPN gets you access to the internal network. You're attached to Active Directory. And if you worked in enterprise space, has anyone ever survived a red team test of their Active Directory? Pretty much there's never a report that goes, wow, you guys did a great job. That is just not, I'm sorry. The red team wins a lot on AD. Like, did you know that you have all these permissions granted to the new users accidentally because Microsoft did an update and it crossed these objects and now there's extra permissions? And it's hard to manage. It's not that there's an inherent problem with Active Directory. It's the scale and scope that it operates at, and trying to manage everything through a bunch of object permissions and setting up everything in Active Directory can be very challenging versus if we start really prescribing what the users can and cannot access, and we go, okay, here's your onboarding list, and we've tied this to the application that manages authentication and says you have to validate who you are, and your job position here as whatever role that is only allows for these line of business applications. And when you check those boxes through the provider, and like I said, they might be using WireGuard as a transport on the back end, but then the application itself goes, nope, I'm only going to give you access to the resources where they are. Kind of the bigger picture too, when you're looking at something like an overlay network, the location of the objects doesn't matter anymore, the locations of those assets. So I can have some stuff that is on-prem because I still have tooling that I need if I'm in manufacturing that only can live on-prem. So only way I can really talk to these, manufacturing machines. On the other side of it lives in the cloud. Instead of split tunneling where I drag my user through my VPN into my domain, back out the VPN to the cloud app, well, this is where overlay VPNs kind of allow resources to exist wherever they exist, multiple locations, some cloud, some on-prem, and we're just provisioning access. And now we're controlling it at a single plane of this is the provision, this is where they're at, and makes it a little bit more to handle at that point.
What is then an overlay VPN in your mind as a category?
As a category, overlay VPN is instead of your traditional hub spoke where I'm logging in and I'm going to go ahead and go to the firewall, and then from the firewall I'll pivot to get to the resource I need. The overlay VPNs act as an extra network interface is how they often show up on the system. So I have my usual how I get out to the internet network face, but there's an additional one, and an additional one is controlled by the overlay system, and then we put these same additional network interfaces on all the assets that we want to access. And I'm always accessing them no matter where I'm at via the overlay. So the overlay VPN will be an encrypted tunnel that maintains access and persistence between all of these. And this allows us to move between networks very smoothly because it doesn't matter if my main adapter changes, the overlay network will allow it to happen. Also it becomes very convenient when people move in or out of different offices. Overlay VPNs will always look for, they very automated, essentially using their own version of open shortest path. And shortest path, if I'm inside the network, because I happen to be at the office, I'll still use the overlay VPN, but it realizes, oh, I don't have to go out to the internet for this at all. So it'll build the tunnel directly. Overlay VPNs are also orchestrated differently, so they don't pass through a cloud provider and back down. Proper overlay VPN implementation often relies on things like UDP hole punching to figure out, all right, the person is at Starbucks, they want to access the office. Is there a connection I can orchestrate? So the cloud tool will orchestrate the connection between the Starbucks and build a secure tunnel to the office. But it also keeps very fast traffic that way because you're kind of bending the tunnels around. And those tunnels, as I said, when they come back to the office, there's still a secure tunnel. You're encrypted on the line here at work between the applications, but you're at full network speed because we don't have to go out to the internet. We can discover locally that you're here. So the overlay VPNs are really solving things in a very interesting way. They're actually not that new in the gaming world. We remember Hamachi was like this cool idea that someone had forever ago, like 20 years ago now. It took forever before someone said, hey, we could probably implement this again and do it cooler.
So in hearing your description of overlay VPN, I get the idea is that it's simplifying my access and creating, it sounds like, a secure tunnel between the client and the destination so that I'm protected if I'm going across a public network or multiple public networks. But I could also hear security folks being like, yeah, but what's inside that tunnel and do I trust it? So how do they handle that aspect?
The nice thing is most of these, and WireGuard is the facilities to handle this. It can do filtering and rules, and they're often going to be managed by whatever the tooling is that sits on top of the overlay VPN. And we can say granular, the application lives on port 443 of this enterprise application. Your role allows you to access this IP of the overlay attached network. That is how the line of business, it's a web app. It's going to be on 443, and that's it. You can't pivot. You can't wander anywhere else. So provided you're setting these up, of course, because anything can be misconfigured. And many of the one of the overlay VPNs by default, they always have an allow all rule because they want to make it so you can get to things. But if you actually took the time to implement them, you would go granular. You would define a role, what this role has access to, and then you would only have allow rules, not just to the IP, but only the ports needed if you can get granular enough. Because now it becomes really hard to pivot because you're like, oh, there's an attack that allows some type of egress or movement of data if it's on this other port because the server runs 4 ports, but the user doesn't access to all 4 ports. The user only needs access to one port where the web interface is. So now you've limited, if someone does take over that, what that attack surface looks like. That user logs in, they can only get to the one thing. So you've narrowed the scope of potential vulnerability. So if the server runs SSH or something else, they don't have access to that port. Just because they have access to the overlay IP, the only thing you've granted them access to is the granular rules to say they only need the web interface to log in and do whatever they do for their line of business app.
Okay, so unlike then, I'm thinking, I guess, of like a SASE application where my traffic is leaving the client, it's hitting the SASE application, they're opening the tunnel, they're inspecting all of that traffic inside, running signatures, doing the L7 firewall, yada, yada, looking for malware and so on, then re-encrypting and sending it on. The way I'm getting control that I'm comfortable with is I'm really fine-graining what this person or device is allowed to access.
Yeah. And if it is a company with a SASE and it does have some of that, it might be some type of proxy that they hit all the time because you want those there. So you would also control fine grained access to that. Because we have seen occasional attacks by some of these companies where the proxy was the attack surface because of some flaw that was found in there. But the more you can limit the control and limit the scope of who can attach to that, we're just reducing the attack surface more and more.
And in the overlay VPNs, I've seen some of your videos. You got us on YouTube, which we'll
Thank you.
give everybody the links in the notes. We'll talk about it at the end. But it looks like you've played with several, I don't know if played is the right word, in your lab and probably for customers, right? You've played with several of these.
Oh, yeah.
Are they typically using IPv6? And what does the setup look like? What do you need to do for business use to implement an overlay VPN?
The good news is the majority of them, I believe they will use IPv6. I know not all businesses are there, so they're 100% IPv4 compatible, mostly IPv6 compatible. They are relatively easy to set up, relatively easy to manage. There's different implementations, but the underlying of them, they work very much the same. There's not even much of speed difference between them because they keep relying on the WireGuard's like the most common building block, it seems like, for all of them. There's only one of them out there I know that's not using WireGuard. And so because they build that, they actually don't seem to have dramatically different speeds or anything like that. It's just the way they are managed. And as you go up in some of the larger enterprise ones, sometimes they have really good integrations with third-party applications. I've even seen some of them that will integrate with security vendors to not allow the connection unless they have the security tooling active and up to date. So that's even part of the integration. Like before you can validate, we're also going to validate this device is up to date. This device has the security tooling that we expect to see on it. Then we can talk about connecting. Those are kind of nice features. So if someone did a bypass on the local endpoint, like we're going to disable your endpoint detection response. Well, if that's not enabled, it also won't bring the tunnel up. So some of them have gone as far as give you good tooling to not allow things you don't want on your network.
So they're starting to cross a little, almost into the ZTNA type of space from a functionality standpoint. Would you be comfortable throwing out like 2 or 3 names of companies that have these solutions just for people that want to like dig a little more into them?
I think the market leader right now by quite a long ways is Tailscale. They're pretty outstanding as a company. They're really interesting. Their business model. Anyone that asks me, like, how do I learn more about some of the network engineering? I was like, one of my favorite write-ups. I've not seen a company do this before, not to this level. If you read the NAT traversal paperwork that is in their blog, it is one of the best lessons you will ever get on NAT traversal. They are proper engineers who did wonderful diagrams, and they talk about every step of the process. Their client is actually open source, which makes it even cooler. And the way their business model works is here's an open source client, Mac, Windows, Linux, phone, etc., Android, Apple, and they've done things to allow the community to bypass them and use third-party tools to play with it. And they're very open. Matter of fact, if you go on GitHub to some of the third-party tools, you'll see the people who actually write Tailscale have contributed code to open source projects that technically compete with them, which is just kind of a nice openness they have about it being really transparent, which makes it easier to adopt and trust because there's nothing shady. I know what's going on my endpoint, things like that. Their business model is selling access to the control plane to give you a control plane to do it, but they also give you really good lockdown tools. So they're not part of your trust circle. They do authentication in a unique way. I'm saying Tailscale because like they have all these features and other people have copied them. But one of the things that's really neat is you don't have to trust us. You build all your trust on your endpoints and do the allow of adding on the endpoint level. They have this really cool zero trust system where our control plane just orchestrates where IPs go. We have no visibility tunnels. We just know it. We're not doing keys. We can't interject ourselves in here. And another one that's fully open source, that's a kind of a copy of Tailscale, but an open source implementation from the control plane as well as the client side is called NetBird. NetBird went a little further and said, they've done a few things at Tailscale we don't like. They made the rules all, I think it's all JSON rules, so not friendly. Why don't we give you a nice, pretty web UI to build all your web rules and your firewall rules between all devices? So they've made a little bit of enhancement. They also have some modular identity provider options. So with like NetBird, they give you, if you have a different IDP provider or you want to use even some of the open source ones like Keycloak, they actually allow other integrations in there, which is becoming popular because not everyone just wants to use the typical IDP system. They want deeper levels of integration or even self-hosted integrations. There's companies that go, I don't know that everything attached to the cloud is what I want. So NetBird is kind of filling that gap, going, we'll give you full inspection of the code because it's 100% open source. We have a business model to support this and help you set it up, but you can self-contain this so you control everything top to bottom yourself. Nothing ever has to leave your own network, and you can build your own cloud infrastructure, so to speak, that you host and manage for it.
So you mentioned Tailscale, NetBird. Any others that come to mind?
Zero tier is really interesting. I believe they also use the noise protocol, but they're not using WireGuard specifically. They've done a slightly different implementation. They are interesting because they talk about it in a vague way because of the way they do it. They are a reseller to a lot of other companies for integration for IoT. So they can build secure tunnels for people who want to have secure devices. They have a whole thing on their site about how they're also an open source company, but they also will resell some of the back end to companies who say, I want to have a bunch of monitoring devices or industrial control devices, but I want them all to phone home in a secure way. And I don't always have access to manage the firewalls at these locations. Like when a vendor's selling a monitoring tool that monitors like an oil rig or something like that, they're popular to embed in IoT devices that can then come back to a central dashboard. I've seen the protocol and I've found it in random devices. And I've talked to the people at Zero Tier a few years ago and learned that's a big part of their business is reselling it that way. But they also have a front end where you can do integration. They're very similar to Tailscale. I think Tailscale's got a more built out and deeper integration. Part of the reason Tailscale is so popular is I believe the people used to work at Google that formed the companies. There's some pretty high level Google engineers that decided to start a company because when they came out with it, it came on strong. Like their version 1 of the product was like, wow, this is a lot of documentation and features. And you start going, who wrote this? Oh, okay. Not their first rodeo.
Yeah. It came out swinging hard, huh?
Yeah, it's cool when you see a V1 product from a company you never heard of going, that's cool. And all the documentation is so well written.
I'll note, JJ, you and I recently did a sponsored episode with a company called Bowtie that I think they're sort of positioning themselves more in the SASE realm, but I'm also hearing some overlap with this sort of overlay VPN category in that Bowtie is also using WireGuard and providing a lot of zero trust capability. So that might be another one to look into.
A lot of them, it's the extra tooling, and that's where Tailscale, they have good integration in solving some enterprise, and they have some enterprise clients, but there are other companies like Bowtie you had mentioned, and yeah, they'll often have deeper integration because that's what you really want. Can I just plug this into my insert name, a line of business application that you already have an integration for? Fantastic.
Right.
So I have a question for the ones you were talking about, like Tailscale, NetBird, Zero Tier, any of those. When you're putting that enforcement point in front of the asset, what does that look like? Is that a VM? Is it something you can embed in that operating system?
Usually you want to embed it in the operating system if possible. There's a couple different ways where you can run it and then use it as what they refer to as like an exit node. So instead of having to load it, if I have 10 applications or 10 VMs, especially if they're vendor supported, I cannot touch them. I cannot load extra things or I'll violate the agreements of the support. I can say, all right, this network, this range, I'm going to use this as what they refer to as an exit node as a term. And what that means is everyone can access that exit node based on the policies I've granted them. And that exit node will then allow access to all the other things. And printers are even a category of that. If I need to send something to the printers, I can't load that on a printer. At my office, Kyocera, Xerox, what are those machines are called now? It's funny. I've been working from home for so long. I know they're there if I go visit someone's office, whatever brands are popular these days. But exit nodes are the solution for that. You can load this on a small Linux VM and say, here's the exit node, and this is how you'll access all those devices. And then normal IP routing actually works the same way for that, which is nice. It has like a backwards layer of compatibility for it. And even some firewalls are integrating and baking Tailscale right in, because the firewall itself can act as the exit node and go, cool, they connect to the firewall, and then the firewall exit nodes to the local network. You can say, advertise these particular networks, and then back to the policy rules, whether or not people also will have access to those networks. And it's kind of a neat way to do that. Matter of fact, Tailscale's got a cool option. Anything, even your phone can be an exit node. You just go in the thing and you go, you know what, my phone's connected. That's an exit node. And then my laptop can exit out my phone if I want.
One thing I'm hearing, though, it sounds like there's also a client agent piece for these overlay VPNs, something on my endpoint device that's helping me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So the way it works, as I mentioned, Tailscale is an easy example because the client itself is open source. So I load the Tailscale client. There's a key authentication to validate it. The app is in the App Store. Anyone can just load it on their phone. Same thing with the Apple. It's in the Apple Store for the Mac M1, or if you're using any of the Windows computers, it's easy enough to just go download the Tailscale client. To build the tailnets, you say, I'm requesting to join this tailnet. There's a link authorization that will go to the company, and you validate the ID. So it's a really simple component on there. And there's not a concept, because WireGuard doesn't have exactly a concept. WireGuard's a peer-to-peer system, and they follow those same rules for the way Tailscale sets up. So you're not authenticating into server. The control plane is just doing key management and user asset management. So we're just going, hey, I want this user to be authenticated, and that could also be a server. That could also be that exit node that lives where our line of business applications are. I just authenticate each one, give it a name, and start building rule sets around how it can access. So some of them aren't actually, especially if you're running this on your server network where your line of business application lives, you're just authenticating that line of business app like this is the resource. It doesn't ever need to be an exit node. People will only attach to it. Matter of fact, you can say it can attach back to people. Maybe you have rules that say it can only send back out on the port that was requested. So you can build some firewall rules around the overlay VPN. This can also slow down things like if I'm trying to egress, because I somehow broke in, I RDP'd in, and I want to egress traffic out, you might be creating some challenges for how they egress traffic out because of the ruling you have on there.
I imagine there's at least one or two firewall admins listening to this going, okay, well, if people are going to be adding overlay VPNs inside of, the environment that I'm protecting with the firewall, if you put this exit node, whatever, on one of these, servers, applications internal, is it directly accessible remotely?
Yes.
So yeah, let's talk about that for a second, because I think this is probably something we need some visibility into.
Yeah. The fun answer is my red team friends, when they're doing enterprise, they love Tailscale. They're like, this thing just flies through everyone's firewall. Because it runs so fast on a Raspberry Pi. If they can get a Raspberry Pi plugged into a port, they're in. It's not a protocol that's blocked very well, I would say, because it's just UDP packets and you're just blending in with the noise here. So yeah, it exits out. It's going to do the connection to those other devices. So yeah, it's pretty much, if it's on your network, I mean, you can crank up the rules. You can do really solid egress filtering, and hopefully people are, but egress filtering is the holy grail. We all say, oh, you could just turn everything off, until you do. And you're like, wait, the whole world is mad at me right now. Everyone's beating down the door of the IT room because we egress filtered too much. Nothing can be accessed. And that does make it very challenging. So it can be filtered. It's just UDP packets. There's nothing obscure about them. They're not secretive other than their WireGuard ones. So you could look for WireGuard going, outgoing. You could do some layer 7 filtering and find it. But so many things are using it. It becomes a really tricky thing of which one is the nefarious one leaving here with a thing versus which one's just something that needs to use to get out.
Yeah, I'm just thinking the SecOps teams need to have some knowledge of this and some type of visibility and way to validate or vet, because, I mean, what you just described, Tom, it's like, okay, you can do your magic on your endpoints with your agents and your servers and see what software is running on it. But if somebody takes a Raspberry Pi or whatever into the environment and plugs it in, you're not going to know until that traffic tries to egress somewhere.
Yeah, it becomes very tricky. The bigger problem we're seeing in security right now is Cloudflare tunnels are creating a nightmare for detection engineers. There's been a rash of people using Cloudflare tunnels for threat actors using them. And do I block Cloudflare? Well, that'll break half the internet. So the same thing when people do like those internal sites for Azure sites and things like that, create a fake page on an Azure site. Well, I can't block Azure. Most of the people are authenticating on Azure. So it becomes very tricky. You would know, because Tailscale obviously has a lot of public IPs. So you could probably figure out through deference, like this goes to Tailscale. This is where it can be interesting as well if you're using something like NetBird and you're hosting your own infrastructure, because then you can validate and say, no one's talking this protocol unless it's going to my defined infrastructure that lives in AWS or wherever it lives. Like, here's the public IP of my NetBird server. I host it. No one can talk to using the WireGuard protocol except for that. And anyone who needs to, and it's blocked and they're complaining, call me, because you're doing something you're not supposed to.
Yeah, I like that approach.
Yeah, this is why self-hosted becomes kind of popular, because for the really tight security-minded people are like, I want very tight controls where I own my own infrastructure. I know what's on it. I can inspect it. We always have to think about these trust matrices we create as we bring vendors in. They're all part of my trust matrix. The infamous incident. We all remember that Target had an incident with their credit cards, but can we name the name of the HVAC company that caused it? Very few people know, because the reality is Target will point the finger. Well, that HVAC company did it. The HVAC. Oh, really? And everyone blames you because you're the one holding the cards that had the credit card breach. So you have to be careful, because as much as we like to claim the responsible party, well, I have a trust matrix and this is who I'll blame. Yeah, but people know your name when you're in the news because you lost or something.
Yeah.
You're always the one with a security incident, even if it was some small vendor you had. So I actually see some people kind of moving towards this. I want to control it so I have better control, because my name's on the line no matter. Cool. My insurance company will let me blame them, but the news will blame me and the employees will blame me. And my career kind of depends on this not happening.
What do you recommend then to SecOps folks who might be thinking, okay, I can see why maybe I would want to use something like Tailscale for remote access for my employees, but what about Tailscale as a threat vector?
Yeah, once again, know thyself, understand and lock down what you're allowing to be accessed on a network. Tailscale can be a little bit of a challenge, because if someone's using it personally and they also want to use it for the work, you're like, ooh, that would be an interesting split. Could they re-register Tailscale to their own and then use it as a threat vector? Maybe. But if you lock things down well enough and you have really solid and tight controls, which are really hard to do, but I've seen a lot of progress made to this, where we control the level of applications that are running on there. We do not have anyone with admin privileges that allow them to add any extra applications. So it's like any other app. I've restricted it. You can't load any other VPN besides the one that the company authorizes. And this is just a different VPN. So we've authorized Tailscale or one of the Bowtie or whoever. We've said this app is allowed to run. We've done an administrative allow to do it. And the user doesn't have the admin privileges to make any changes on that. So it's just like treated like any other software policies.
I'm curious, we've really been talking about enterprise and business use case for these overlay VPNs, which I think is really important. But I know a lot of people have questions around personal VPNs. And so I think a long time ago, Drew and I, when we talked a little bit about VPNs, and we kind of chunked everything into, typically you use a VPN for one of two purposes. Either, in a corporate environment where you're trying to access some resource remotely, like get to a file storage or internal to the network, or, somewhere to give you, a network level access to resources that are not located with you. But then the other use case is from a privacy perspective. When you're floating around the world and traveling, you can use a VPN, not that you need it to get to something else, but you're kind of containerizing and obscuring your traffic from all of the little eyes that are looking at your data along the way.
Yeah, you don't have to be traveling to want to do that.
That's true. Yeah. Like all of my stuff auto flip, they just stay on VPN everywhere all the time unless there's a problem. Yeah. I have a funny story about recent travel. I was at a hotel at a wireless conference where usually everybody's behaving pretty well, but there was some sketchy stuff happening, and the conference network was running over the hotel's network, and somebody had set up some pretty interesting DHCP.
Wow.
They were serving their own DHCP and capturing DNS and stuff.
Yep.
And I actually needed to do a money transfer for something.
Oh.
And I finally just hit the point. I kept getting DOS of my hotspot on my phone, which is a WPA3 secured, Wi-Fi network. And I finally just hit the point where I was like, I will wait till I get home to do this, because I don't even want anybody seeing that I'm accessing this resource. But in corporate as well, because if you think about like executives, when you're looking for an indicator, I'm talking about like upper echelon execs in large fortune companies, right? When you're looking at like what they might be doing in terms of like divestments or mergers or acquisitions, one of the indicators is like the board members and the executive leadership, are they visiting certain websites? Right? Are they exhibit like certain behavior that everybody says, well, who cares what website you're browsing to, or who cares what this or what that? It's encrypted, but just by nature of browsing to certain sites, you're giving up some information. So back to my question for you around kind of personal use VPNs from this privacy perspective. Any recommendations around that in terms of products or technology?
I don't want to sound like an advertisement. I have no business affiliation with Tailscale, but they actually partner with Molvad. And so Tailscale is free for personal use for quite a few devices. And they have a Molvad option. So if you wanted to have Molvad integrated, you could just say, take this device and exit out like Molvad VPN. I thought it was kind of novel. They built it in there. It's handy. And obviously we want to not give up any metadata about ourselves. That's really where we're at here, especially if you are a high net worth individual, you're going to have a more targeted attack, any metadata about you, or you're some person who posts on YouTube, talks about security, and people really want to say, let's just say I get some cryptic messages.
Yeah, it would be really good to just turn the screws on that person. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't like him. He said too many words on security. Let me take him down a notch. And I don't want to do it in a YouTube comment. I'd like to actually, yes, there's some, I get the craziest phishing emails.
Sorry, you said Molvad. I'm not familiar with that. What is Molvad?
They're one of the VPN providers. So you've got like Proton VPN, Molvad
Yeah.
VPN, private internet access. They're all slowly consolidating. There used to be a lot more of them. Those are the top 3 ones I can think of like privacy VPNs. And, those are becoming more and more popular as things change, especially in Europe or the US, as there's policy changes or administrative changes that make people go, there's a lot of metadata collected about me that maybe I don't want. Maybe I would like to look up something that I don't think that my internet service provider should have visibility into, because they're among the people that have been known to sell your data, because they can go, I can watch all these DNS queries that come from this particular IP address. And because I'm paying the bill for it, they go, I probably know what that person's looking up. So it's become quite popular. Matter of fact, I kind of laughed when they had passed some policies of what can and can't be viewed online in different states. Many of the large companies that provide such services that maybe not safe for work realized that when they started enacting these laws to block things from Texas and many of the other southern states, VPN provider actually had posted, I think we have a DDoS attack. We just had like 8,000 people sign up in an hour. And they're like, 2 hours later, like, okay, 50,000 people realized the US just made some law changes just that were enacted, I think on January 1st. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of people that go, I still want to access the internet the way I want to access the internet. So VPNs and popping you out of a location, not to mention the problem many people have if you travel, you're like, I'd like to watch the next episode of the series I'm watching. And if you travel abroad, you'll find out that that is blocked in the country you're in. So exiting out the country where you want to watch your show, it's a valid use. You're paying for the account. You are a citizen of the country where you pay for the account, but you happen to be in England. So popular use of it.
Well, Tom, I have to ask you this question because I know you do a lot of work, in security, both with, personal technologies and business technologies. I recently saw an article in Wired that talked about a potential ban of TP-Link products here in the US. And with the caveat to the listeners that might not have read this yet, that TP-Link a few years ago did like completely separate. And so there is the Chinese company, and then completely separately now is a US based company with its own corporate structure. But it is the US company that they're talking about banning. So I didn't know what are your thoughts on this? And then also kind of beyond this one brand into sort of these other Chinese crossover technologies.
Yeah, we need to really have a better policy discussion. The UK's done a good job of this, of creating some guidelines for how these consumer-based devices should be marketed, how they should be updated, how they should be supported, and how they should be secured. And I think we really need a better policy discussion around that. So TP-Link may be the hot topic of the day, especially when that came out in Wired. But the hot topic of March right now, beginning of March, where we're recording this, is there's a massive botnet that is doing major attacks, and it's all based on a bunch of stupid, really poorly coded NVR things that people buy. Like maybe there's a lot of small businesses that buy them too, camera systems. So it's the same conversation. The ban is not for the protection of the users. Matter of fact, many of these people don't even know that they're part of a botnet, because no one's going to replace their TP-Link while it's attacking. And it's one TP-Link. It's barely taking up much bandwidth. So my internet works. I can still do my daily tasks, but it's when you have 30,000 of these. And one of the challenges we have in the US is we have a lot of infrastructure that can be knocked offline, our banking, our not necessarily power grid, but the way we control some of the power grid. Because if we do a denial of service, we can't make those adjustments across the internet because, well, there's just too much noise from these botnets. So when you go, okay, I can block foreign threat actors, I can block country, I can do those country level. I can't block from inside the US because I can't determine if it's actually a user or a botnet trying to log into these. So it's for the protection of US infrastructure that there's a lot of bans being considered on these types of devices, TP-Link being the hot topic, because they've been known. And I think it's one of those things, what do they say? Don't think there's malice when ineptitude will do. They just don't want to bother. There's a really good, I think it was the British GC did a deep dive on some of the other manufacturers. It wasn't TP-Link, it was like Huawei ones, but they said they're running some stuff that's like PHP version 4. Like they're so many years behind. They're not bothering updating their tool sets. They're writing some of the worst code. And it's because, well, if we spent money on better developers and new code, that would raise the price of the product. And I want to make it $29.99 for a firewall. And so there's some sacrifices were made in development. I don't know that it's actually malicious, but it's also certainly not secure. So it creates these entry points for, the Mirai botnet, probably the most persistent because it keeps evolving to goes, hey, we can infect this model TP link, get them on the botnet. And, here in March of 2025 is the current, I think their Hikvisions are the most popular brand because guess what? There's hard coded, can't change passwords they found in all these cameras. So it just, all it's doing is logging in, injecting its own firmware, and yay, I've got another team member for the botnet. So I think we need to have a policy discussion.
I think you're talking about the 1111, and I just saw the
Yep.
updated report from, I guess, yesterday. So they did update that number from 30,000 devices to 86,000
Yep.
compromise as of a couple days ago. So yeah, all kinds of different things being hit on that one. And Gray Noise has some neat tracking on it. And Zyzel, right? Zyzel also has like a long list. So Zyzel, another kind of home residential consumer
Yep.
Soho type of router. And we've had, 0 day after 0 day KEVs, known exploited vulnerabilities happening on Zyzel routers, which are not Chinese. But yeah, so I think to your point, is that the biggest risk that we have a company that used to be associated with China in the face of everything else getting completely owned across the board right now?
Yeah, I feel like it ties back to that story. I can't remember which Chinese state actor, Salt Typhoon or the other, that basically pwned a bunch of US telecom infrastructure.
Yeah.
After all the Huawei stuff had been taken out, like the name on the tin doesn't really matter. It's the software inside and how well it's maintained. And if we're going to be talking about policy, we want to be focused on outcomes, not on let's kick this person out and make it look like we're doing something when we actually haven't made anything safer.
Yeah, well, because some of the more recent reports on some of the Salt Typhoon was like they were talking about they exploited. I remember the CV. I don't remember the exact number, but all I know is the first few digits were 2023, and they were exploiting it actively. And it's like all I need to know is they still haven't patched. And it was a Cisco vulnerability. I'm like, so the Cisco equipment still hasn't been patched in 2 years for a known vulnerability, and that's how they got in. And because I seen an updated report, and I'm like, that's ridiculous. So it's not even a Huawei problem anymore. It's a
Right.
you're not patching. There's not any true consequences for it because most of the telco's infrastructure is built around securing how do we get billing out faster, not how do we stop threat actors who want to listen to phone calls.
Well, I think there's probably about to be consequences for that.
I have a feeling, yeah, I think they may have to actually invest in their infrastructure a little. The incentive might be there now.
What a novel idea.
Yeah.
I'm betting against, but I guess we can circle back around on that.
Yeah. I hope it gets better. I mean, if not, the security podcast will march on. We have plenty to talk about next year.
It's great for podcasters.
It's great for podcasts.
So speaking of working in this field, you obviously like self-inflicted pain. So one of the things I noticed when I was clicking around your website is a whole page on hot sauces.
Yes.
So we got to talk about that for just a minute.
It started, and we built a firewall at the office of hot sauces. And it's labeled the firewall. It's just a whole row of hot sauces. It's just this fun joke. It just turns out a lot of us like spicy. And as anything, it becomes somehow competitive of I can eat something spicier than you. But I actually really enjoy the flavor of a lot of these hot sauces. So once I realized we're getting to the extracts, I had to stop. I do like flavors. We do like the hot ones show. We've always joked we think it'd be a fun thing is to do a hacker hot ones and where people like eat a spicy pepper and see if they can break into something. We just think that'd be fun. I don't know if there's probably some trademark problems I'd run into, but
Right.
but the idea is there. It sounds like a lot of fun. Yeah, it's just something we do. It also becomes a discussion point and some personality when your texts go out somewhere and they have it on your website and they go, "Hey, I see you. Didn't you guys like the hot sauce or whatever?" And comes a reason to talk to the clients. Conversation piece too.
But do you want to weigh on a favorite or you love them all?
I go back to the most basic. I love Red Hot. So the most prominent one is probably Red Hot. Also El Yucateca. So those are the basics. I love all the fancy ones I can get from everywhere. But the ones I probably consume the most of is my big bottles of Red Hot that my wife is just like, "You're ridiculous." But it's like hot sauce and eggs in the morning is my favorite thing. So
I'm with you on the El Yucateca. And in my house, it's Cholula and some Sriracha now and then. Yeah.
oh, Cholula, their Chipotle one is really tasty. There's actually a dill pickle Red
Ooh.
Hot that is I've only can find it once in a while at stores, and it's been a new favorite I have. I did not think I thought, okay, this is a terrible idea. If you put dill seeds in Red Hot, and I had it, and I'm like, oh, I think I went through a bottle pretty quickly. But I can only find it in the small bottles, and I usually buy the big bottles.
Well, all right, we have to leave the hot sauce discussion because it's time to wrap. But Tom, if folks want to reach out to you about security or see your YouTubes or just get in touch, what should they do?
All things start at lawrencesystems.com. That's where you'll find all the socials, whichever one you'll find me on there. Of course, if you Google Lawrence Systems, the YouTube channel is not too hard to find, but there's links on there. I am really dedicated to my forums. That's where a lot of people have some engaging conversations. They're always free to sign up, just have a discussion and tech things in there. But that's everything. Just head to lawrencesystems.com. That's where you'll find me.
Awesome. That's Lawrence Systems. Go check them out on YouTube and everywhere else. Thank you, Tom, for being here. I really enjoyed this discussion. Thanks to you for joining us for this episode of Packet Protector. If you have a topic you want us to cover, you can find JJ and I on LinkedIn or at packetpushers.net/community. We do have a free Slack channel with other IT and security pros. Or if you have a comment, correction, question, reach out at packetpushers.net/FU. We do love follow-up and we appreciate when listeners reach out. As always, keep eating that security hot sauce.